And okay, we are live. All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And thanks for joining us for another of our virtual events. And today we're delighted to have authors Toni Anderson and Rachel Grant with us. And I welcome guys for one thing, but I also would I'd love to read both of your author about the author blurbs here, because they're both so fascinating and cool. So let me go ahead and do that real quick for everybody watching. Let's see here. Toni Anderson is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author. Her books have won the Daphne du Maurier Award for Excellence in Mystery and Suspense, Reader's Choice, Aspen Gold, Book Buyer's Best, Golden Quill, National Excellence in Storytelling Contest, and National Excellence in Romance Fiction Awards. She's been a finalist in both the Vivian Contest and the Rita Award from the Romance Writers of America. 3 million copies of her books have been downloaded. Best known for her cold books, perhaps it's not surprising to discover that Toni lives in one of the most extreme climates on Earth, Manitoba, Canada. Formerly a marine biologist, Toni still misses the ocean, but is lucky enough to travel for research purposes. This is cool. In January 2016, she visited FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., including a tour of the Strategic Information and Operations Center. She hopes not to get arrested for Google searches. I think we all have to worry about that, don't we?
We do.
So Toni's new book is called Cold Silence. There's a copy of it right here. And we do have signed book plates. It was kind of hard to ship books back and forth to Manitoba, but we appreciate you sending the signed book plates. And as we go on here, I'll put buy links in the comments field on Facebook, should you wish to purchase one. And Rachel Grant, latest book is called Into the Storm in the Evidence Under Fire series. There we go. And I'm going to read yours too, because it's I love these author blurbs. Let's see, USA Today bestselling author Rachel Grant worked for over a decade as a professional archaeologist and mines her experiences for storylines and settings, which are as diverse as excavating a cemetery underneath an historic art museum in San Francisco, survey and excavation of many prehistoric Native American sites in the Pacific Northwest, researching an historic concrete house in Virginia, and mapping a 17th century Spanish and Dutch fort on the island of, you have to pronounce that, Sint Maarten, the Netherlands, Antilles. She lives in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome, both of you guys. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
And Barbara would normally be hosting, but she's unable to do it at the moment. So what I'm going to be doing is, if y'all have questions for Rachel or Toni, please don't be shy. Go ahead and put them in the comments field, and I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel and Toni. If you guys want to have a nice chat, I'll just kind of lurk in the background if needed.
So sometimes you get to be just really, really lucky in that one of your favorite authors becomes one of your best friends. And that's, really what has happened with Toni and I over the years. We first met because we were in a box set together. And then we started reading each other's books, and I immediately knew, oh, my readers would love this. And I think Toni, had the same reaction, and we just started reaching out to each other, and just slowly, I have now grabbed onto Toni, and she's never allowed to, not be part of my world, my writing world, but, also a deep and close friend. And so it's really a pleasure to get to do this chat together, talking about our books, because we also, probably know more about each other's writing processes than most people.
That's true. It's very true. Yeah, well, I'm very lucky that we did cross paths, Rachel. I'm very grateful to have you in my writer world.
So one of the things that, there's a lot of parallels that just sort of happen naturally with us when we're writing, and we don't even realize it. Like the fact that both of our books that we're talking about today are the first in a new series, but they're also a spin-off series of our best-selling, series books. So Toni's is Cold Silence, and it's the first in her hostage rescue. So it's what is the series name? Is it Cold Silence? Or Cold Justice.
Cold Justice Most Wanted.
Most Wanted. Most Wanted. It's not an HRT, yeah. but
it is HRT.
That is but it's not the name. But yeah. So Cold Justice Most Wanted. What is that? And how is it different from Cold Justice and Cold Justice: The Negotiators?
Yeah. So Cold Justice Most Wanted does focus on HRT. So the FBI's hostage rescue team is the only dedicated full-time counter-terrorist unit within the US federal law enforcement system. So they're basically like special forces, but they can arrest people. But you do not have to be special forces to get into the hostage rescue team. So this new series of books has basically focusing on this team of characters that I've been building in the other books. So the original Cold Justice series concentrated on, the almost classic FBI stories. They were BAU, so profilers and serial killers and that kind of thing. Although, gosh, I seem to have serial killers in every genre, every series of books I write regardless. So, and then the first spin-off was The Negotiators, and part of the FBI's one of their big divisions is the Crisis Negotiation Unit, is within a similar organization as HRT within the FBI. And so that was all focusing on negotiators. And within that, there was a few books where the HRT people turned up to help save the day. And I knew that one day I wanted to write stories focusing on HRT because it's a little bit different to it's a little bit of a different mindset, I think, to classic FBI stories. It's a little bit more, kind of track people over through the wilderness and bash down doors. So it's just a little bit different to what I've been writing.
Action.
A lot more action. Oh, that's my dog.
Wouldn't it also require a lot of psychological training and different aspects of different disciplines, all involved in that job, I would think. I
think so. And the psychological and the physical fitness. I mean, you have to be able to fast route out of helicopters and that sort of thing, maintain marksmanship while you're moving at high speed. So it's all very, special forces training. They have the kill houses, they have assaulters and the sniper units, but they also have to make sure they stay within the law in terms of arrest procedures and evidence collecting. So it's slightly, more complicated, I guess, to a degree. Although, I'm sure the Navy SEALs Rachel would say otherwise, which is what your book, I don't have a copy in front of me, but Into the Storm concentrates on Navy SEALs. And that's one of the things I was going to ask you about, is the fact that Suzanne Brockman probably launched the whole romantic suspense Navy SEAL phenomenon, and but you have Navy SEALs in this book. So, what do you think? What attracted you to writing about them?
There's several different reasons. I've written SEALs in some books, and I've written Green Berets, and it's really always driven by the role that the plot of the story and what special forces team is going to be important. But this book in particular has a very unique origin in that a lot of my readers know my husband is an archaeologist as well, and he is an archaeologist for the Navy. And for much of the last 5 years or more, one of his jobs for the Navy here in Washington State was to assess the potential for Navy SEAL training in Washington State parks for the impact it could have on archaeological and cultural resources. And he worked with a team of people who were evaluating this, but he was pretty heavily involved with this process of approving or trying to get Navy SEAL trainings approved in Washington state parks. And because I think a lot of people don't realize that, SEALs train actually here a lot. I mean, we have a lot of Navy bases. My husband works for the Navy. We live close to a Navy base. We live also close to the Bremerton Navy Yard. And so it's a natural setting for trainings to happen when you have the facilities nearby. We have a Naval Air Station on Whidbey Island and everything. And so as my husband was, he only shares what he can, what the public information and everything, but as he was talking about the process that they were going through, my brain just started spinning of, well, what if you have a training in a park that is compromised, and the SEALs are not allowed to use have explosives or bullets on when they're training in Washington state parks. I mean, go figure, that they're not allowed to accidentally shoot people in the park, and so they have simunition. And he even there were a few times where SEALs teams would come to his office and demonstrate, like, basically, this is how we are not going to impact the environment. This is how we are going to be safe. And they even demonstrated their use of simunition for these trainings. And so, of course, my brain starts spinning and is like, okay, what if you have a team of unarmed SEALs, essentially, in a remote wilderness with no communication, and the training has been compromised, and so basically it's an attack on special forces on U.S. soil. So that was, it was like the book wrote itself. So that was why it was SEALs in particular, though. But one of the funny things about this whole process, well, one, just as a caveat, I chose a national park because of the particular setting that I wanted for the story, which was not my husband's job. And national parks were never, part of SEAL training exercises here. But
that you know of.
That I know of, exactly, because there's some parameters that it could probably happen without us knowing, without where you wouldn't necessarily require public notice, because that's the thing, is that public notice is required for these military actions. But last spring, or no, it was late last winter, I think it was in February, there was a ruling in Washington state, a court ruled that Navy SEALs cannot train in state parks anymore, which it came down in like I said, in February. It doesn't affect my book. I was in a national park anyways. But also, there's also, if you parse out the timeline, the books actually took place before that ruling. But also, but they're still training. They're just not allowed to do it at state parks. And the judge's ruling had actually nothing to do with cultural resources, although for a number of years, cultural resources was the hang up on whether or not SEALs could train. And so that's why in my author's note, I say, giving Audrey, my heroine, the final approval over whether or not the SEALs could train in the park was not an exaggeration. There's definitely, it was a big issue for the state parks on whether or not there would be harm to archaeological sites. So so that part was, actually very accurate to the setup of the story. But they still do so. But the reason the judge ruled that they can't train is just comfort level of people in parks. Like you don't want to ever worry that you're camping in a park and SEALs are doing an op in the middle of the night. So it's like, okay, I understand that. It would be really interesting though. I could take notes. So
yeah, you've already got to watch out for Sasquatch out there.
Yeah, so. Yes, exactly. And so there have been a few times where my husband has had to do sensitivity trainings for SEALs on how to not hurt archaeological and historic sites. And I just find that hilarious that he's had to do that. And in fact, the same week this book released, he had to do another training for SEAls.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So
serendipity.
Yeah.
So and that's the other question I was going to ask you. So we were talking about one of the things about this book in particular is, I think of all your books, is that the setting is definitely a character within the story.
Yeah, I love, setting is pretty much almost always a character for me, simply because one of the ways my plot is shaped is around the history and archaeology of a place, and so once once you're making that part of the story, then the setting, is playing a role because it's so that's part of it. But this one in particular, yes, because I put them in a remote spot on the Olympic Peninsula. It's a gorgeous temperate rainforest. It gets more rain than, it's the whole reason the Twilight books were set in Forks is because of the gloom and doom and the rain. And this, I'm basically, I think I'm like 30 miles inland from Forks with this setting. I'm on the slopes of Mount Olympus, which I think that they're one of the stats I read was like one of the peaks of Mount Olympus is the rainiest spot in the lower 48. Like, gets more rain than anywhere else. And so it's a rainforest, shocking. But it's also cold and miserable. And I put them there in January because, I like to torture my characters.
Yeah, well, my favorite scene from this book, and I was telling you earlier, is when, so there's a great setup for the story, which I won't actually say because I don't want to ruin any plots, but basically the hero is really messed up.
He's really messed up before page one.
Before page one, really messed up. So my favorite bit of the story is when the heroine, she comes back to the lodge to check on a situation in this remote lodge, and he basically handcuffs her because he thinks she's interfering or sabotaging. And the whole time it's going on, I think every reader is thinking, he is going to regret this so much. Every word, everything, every mistake he makes along the way. And the reader is thinking, no.
Yeah, and how am I going to like him? I know that that's one of the things that I've heard from a lot of readers who are like, I did not believe that I was going to be able to like this hero, that I was going to fall in love.
How do you redeem that?
He really did. And it was so the heroine shows up in chapter 1. She shows up just in time to interrupt this Navy SEAL training that's about to start, because she has some cameras that she has. She's an archaeologist for Olympic National Park, and she's denied this training, that she did not approve it because she was afraid it was going to what the SEALs were going to do could damage archaeological sites. And one of the sites that's very close to this historic lodge has already had some looting at a site right near there. And so she's set up cameras to monitor the site, and the cameras have gone down. And very mysteriously, it doesn't look like it's, a normal reason, like it's not a power outage or anything. And so she shows up at the lodge to find out what's wrong with cameras. Is the site being looted again? And she interrupts the start of this training that she didn't know was going to happen, and comes face to face with this man who very much betrayed her when she denied the training, he went around her to make it happen. And so it's a fun scene. I mean, it was the first chapter wrote itself.
Handcuffs that early in the novel?
Yes.
Off to a good start, right?
Yeah. He feels really bad later, really bad.
I know. I'm glad you torture him. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Toni made sure that I tortured him, because I was kind of nice to him in my first draft, and she was like, no. I think there was one point, one of her comments in the margins was, I would be sticking a pencil in his ear. She was right.
Yeah, readers would understand.
Can you both kind of speak a little bit to, you both come, if I'm understanding it correctly, from the romance background, or kind of a hybrid of these two different genres. Can you talk about sort of the challenges of combining the two genres and to create something new?
You take that, Toni?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think romantic suspense is that new. It's definitely evolving into more thriller realms. I think it's a real skill to to balance the romance and authentic thriller plot within a book, you have to, and this is what I do throughout my draft. So the first time I've got too much romance in it, and it's normally the thriller plot itself is normally okay. Once you've drafted it and got the first draft, you can normally finagle any loose ends, and but the romance angle within a romantic suspense, I think you have to basically really work on it to make sure it's not too much at some points, and or not too little in other places. And I think you just have to intertwine the two as well. You can't have just like the romance can't be like the side. These two people are becoming romantically involved and the plot is over here. The two have to be linked, and if you kind of take these characters away, the romance wouldn't happen, and also the plot, the thriller aspect, suspense plot wouldn't happen either. So I think the real key is to literally to weave them both together equally.
I think one of the, you mentioned one of your favorite scenes in Into the Storm, and one of my favorite scenes in Cold Silence is it really revolves around the fact that these two people have to work together. And I love that. I love that when you have, especially in romance, if they haven't met each other already, there's not even a backstory between them yet, but they find themselves in a situation where they have to work together, and they're getting to know each other, and they can be brushing up against each other, and but there's that working together and Toni does it so well in Cold Silence that where they develop this working relationship where neither one of them is going to, no one is going to be successful without the skill set of the other, and then there's a scene where I don't want to give any spoilers because it's a little later in the book, but where they have basically come to that understanding of that ability to work together in spite of various obstacles, and she uncovers something, and he needs backup, and it just kind of showcases that they're both really bringing something to it, and that's romantic suspense. Both characters really need to bring something to the story. Without the romance, the story would fall apart, and without the suspense thriller, then it would be
romance would never happen.
Romance, which would be fine, but that's not what we write. We both like to hurt people.
That's interesting, that of course the romantic tension is very important, but also these are ensemble casts. Mm-hmm. As you say, it's not. Your books don't have one set protagonist. It's a group, and as you say, they all bring different skills to the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely. And also a quick question, since you're both dealing with Navy SEALs and these sort of elite groups that have very specialized skill sets. One of the programs, or one of the trying to remember, one of the programs we did with a bunch of military action adventure novelists, we were discussing, when we talk to them, we always discuss, how do you balance the, how much technical jargon or technical background do you put into the books? And I guess the same question would apply to you guys. It must be a fine balance. How much you want to show off, okay, I've done my research here, I'm getting these facts right, but you don't want to slow down the story. Is that often a tricky thing?
Well, my husband wants me to include chapter and verse from the federal code of, regulations on. There were many conversations where I was like, no, it's just one sentence. It's just one sentence to explain what happened with the permit. But no, yeah, definitely with this book in particular, I describe the forest a lot because they're stuck in the forest a lot. And I dialed it back in a few places, but in other places I was like, no, again, this setting is a character. This setting is very much impacting every choice, everything that they do. And so I left more of it in than I think I usually would. And I was actually a little concerned, you know, it's like, and, you know, I'm sure that some people do find that boring. They don't want to, you know all about the different, you know, leaves and pine trees and moss and lichen. But also so many of the reviews, people are like, I just was there. I was in it was like a movie happening in my mind where I could, you know, feel the cold, you know, rain on the back of my neck and that kind of thing. So that's always gratifying. So for you, Toni?
Yeah, well, I think for me, you know, I'm into learning, and I will do research until I, you know, can't see. Basically, I never stop. So if I go down that hole too much, and I do go down that hole, then I also recognize the danger in never writing the book. So what I tend to do, because I love naming all the weapons and the bullets and the, you know, the caliber of this and that, and, you know, even
they'll tell you when you get it wrong too, won't they?
Oh yeah, totally. But nobody's told me that yet, but just saying.
Never gets it wrong. Never.
Well, I'm sure I do, but yes. But I'm sure that if I do, I will have a reason for it. I tend to, yeah. So you do a lot of research, and I find that again, first draft, everything's in there, and too much detail, too many boring slow bits. So, and then by the second draft or third draft, you know, when you're reading through, you notice when the pace is slowing. So I think as soon as your pace is starting to slow, then you have to start cutting that information, and that's the key to have some authentic details, but you can't slow your pace, the pace of the plot down.
Yeah, that definitely is much more in revisions than in first draft. First draft, I just throw everything in, and then I realized that I actually mentioned that particular tidbit 4 times. That's it. Yeah.
I was just going to say, a good friend of ours, and I'm sure of yours too, Jane Ann Krantz, is watching, and she's a brilliant woman and has a wonderful question here. She says, I find it fascinating that here in North America, we write and read books in which law enforcement characters are heroes. And yet we also invented the dirty cop story. Do you think this comes from our Western myths? Romantic suspense favors heroes.
There's a big trend right now in a different kind of romantic suspense that Toni and I don't write, which is the dark romance.
The anti-hero.
The mafia boss, and so that has its own like very separate following, I think. But I would, that's a great question. Thank you, Jane. Also, how do I answer it?
I think there's with any books and stories, you know, there's the whole superhero thing. So there's a lot of you know, you can, and police officers or elite units can speak to that, the fact that we're attracted to superheroes and people who are supposed to keep us safe.
Yeah.
And
the idealized version.
And I think, you know, the bad guy normally has to be equal to your protagonist. So therefore, why wouldn't he be a police officer or a dirty cop? And, you know, if you're really going to have equals in power, then you need to make them equal in power. So maybe it's just a reflection of that, literally, you know, looking at mirror images.
Don't you find that kind of complicated, vulnerable heroes are irresistible? I mean, there's the whole journey of, you know, a real hero's journey where the character goes through their own personal struggles and challenges, you know, I think of the period of disillusionment and then the return, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that, you know, it's the shades of gray, you know, it's not the black hat and the white hat so much, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
So, the original hero of the first book in my Cold Justice series is actually well, is this a spoiler? I don't think so. No, he's actually a covert assassin. So, you know, so he literally goes around killing people, but he is the hero. So he has a lot of doubts about himself
Yeah.
and what he does and his self-worth. And I think actually doubting self-worth is probably one of the main themes of my books. The hero and the heroine both doubting themselves as to whether or not they're worthy of not just the true love, but fighting evil, being the good guy.
That humanizes the characters, and I think lots of us can relate to that. A lot of readers can relate to that.
I think it's incredibly important to write flawed characters. As we were talking about Xavier, my hero, he really does something horrible before the book even starts. So there's a flaw. But that's, I don't want to read books about characters who, I like superhero stories and I love Captain America, but he's a little too perfect, although they do best when he's actually exploring the darker side. He's not just rah USA. He's actually, but anyways, that's a whole other thing about, what can make the perfect character more interesting is when they're not necessarily, they're maybe aligning themselves with I'm going to lose my thread here. Where they're looking at the darker side of society and maybe having to go into the dark side to do the right work. I guess that's
or sympathizing with the criminal.
Sure.
Yeah.
Who wants to read about well-adjusted people making healthy life decisions? Where's the book?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and there's also,
definitely.
a reflection of a corrupt system at play.
Mm-hmm.
So many things enter into this. Does she possess, obviously some of the biographical material with the archaeology. Is that fun to throw some of your own knowledge in there?
Yeah, it's always it's a big comfort zone for me, especially that this book is set in Washington State, where I've done a lot of field work and where my husband works for the Navy. Basically it was like, well, it was very she's easier to write than a lot of my other heroines. They're not. I often will do different aspects of archaeology or anthropology, and I have a few heroines who aren't archaeologists at all. They're spies or photographers or or an online sex worker. But but those are different kind of books.
A little something for everybody.
Yeah. but her background was very easy to write, but she's also way more successful than me as an archaeologist. She got a PhD and continued on, and I did not. I have just a bachelor's, and I, like I said, I worked for a decade in the field, and my husband has a master's degree, and he's much more advanced and has now 30 plus years experience in the field, and so I get to draw on his experience, and I always enjoy whatever story I'm writing, especially when I give them an archaeology, anthropology, or Toni and I've talked about this, and we can expand on it some more. Characters in STEM, women in STEM. For me, it feeds my desire to basically learn all the things that I didn't learn because I never went back to school to get a graduate degree. I love researching all the various aspects of whatever specialty my heroine has. And I will go down rabbit holes like Toni, talks about, where it's like, I just needed to look up one little thing, and 3 hours later, I'm like, wow. And it's important to both Toni and I to write women in STEM, and Toni can talk about that too. Toni has a PhD in marine biology and has written a few heroines who are marine biologists, but also other STEM fields. And so if you want to talk about that, Toni.
Yeah, well, I have a friend and a reader who actually complains that if I ever write heroines who are not in STEM, which is a bit awkward because they can't all be scientists. But I think it is very important to showcase that women can have successful careers in science and technology, and the heroine of Cold Silence doesn't have a PhD or any formal training, but she is also very, brilliant at her self-taught hacking skills.
How do you
I don't know
pronounce
if they're
Yale?
Yale, yeah,
Yale, okay.
Yale.
Yeah.
So
Everybody's saying it. Yeah.
Yale and Shane.
I know, but I have heroines who are, I've got quite a few PhD octopus biologist, I've got a frog biologist, I've got a solid state physicist, and oh gosh, what's the other one? It doesn't matter, but lots of these, and some people that have, some characters who have my training, marine biology or fish biology. So they are fun to write. But what I made a big mistake of doing, so I wrote a book and set it in Northern Labrador, kind of based on a study that I'd done in the 90s. And then I decided for some reason to give my heroine diabetes. So type A diabetes on top, because I must have thought this was going to be easier. She's basically doing the same study I did, and okay, she's involved in a murder mystery. But then I had to read so much information on diabetes and how it affected people, and not just as a medical condition, but as a lifestyle. And I was thinking, I'm never ever doing this again. It is so hard.
Did you write yourself into a corner?
I didn't. It all worked out in the end, and it all worked into the plot.
It's a brilliant book too, and I know you've gotten some letters from readers who really appreciated the accurate representation of that, and that's
I have, and it's probably a bit dated now because I know the technology has moved on tremendously, which is fantastic. But it was actually really eye-opening for me to research that book, because I think I went into it a little with overconfident. I'll do this, and it turned into a much bigger deal in research. It's probably the most research I've ever done for a book, which is saying something.
Well, I think that overconfidence it's sort of what keeps us writing, though. Like, if we didn't have that overconfidence, we wouldn't push ourselves to and then jump in and then just be like, oh wow, I really messed up here, but I'm committed now, so
yeah, nuclear physicist, who thought that was a good idea?
I actually I have a heroine that is on the page written that she's a theoretical physicist, and people keep asking for her book. And I've listened to multiple books written by theoretical physicists, so I can try to get into this woman's head, and she's too smart for me. I mean, I still am going to do it. I'm going to write her someday, but it's really daunting, and I really have deep regrets.
That brings up an interesting point, because you hear people say, and I just want to ask if you agree with the whole write what you know thing. I think it's a bunch of crap, because I mean, half the great books would not exist if people stuck to writing what their own personal experience.
I think it's fabulous advice for just starting out, and that is actually what I did. I actually thought I was going to write historical romance. Once upon a time, it was like, oh, I'm going to write historical romance, and then I sat down to start my first novel, and I was like, and so I was like, okay, I should write what I know. Well, I know archaeology, and the book is Grave Danger. I cut it on the shelf behind me. And it's very, very much set in the Pacific Northwest on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State. And it even
feeds into your...
It does, actually. Yeah, I still use pieces from that book. And the archaeologist is a contract archaeologist, and there's a dig, and she finds human remains in an archaeological site that could be archaeological, but she recognizes immediately they are not. It is a modern skeleton, and therefore a murder victim, because buried without clothes in the middle of this. Anyways, and so it was very much like, that's what got me started. Writing what I knew took away the fear of writing. And so I did that for a number of books, and it was a long time before I started writing books with heroines who are not archaeologists, and or who been places I haven't been, or so I had to get comfortable first. But yeah, now I totally agree that writing what you know is not required.
Well, it seems
Yeah.
like it seems like, there are people that say, well, you can't, if you're a man, you can't write from a female perspective, or vice versa,
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, it's just my
Yeah.
opinion. It
Yeah,
seems like
No, yeah.
each book should be judged by its own merits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the writing's good enough, then the writer pulls it off. Great,
Totally. I agree. I don't think you have to write what you know either. My first book is a former FBI agent who goes on the run from the mob and ends up in a ranch in Montana. And I wrote this when I was it started in Ontario, but it was in Scotland for most of it. And it was actually before the internet was really any real use. So it was all book research, and I again spent a lot of time researching it. But I think you can, as long as you draw on your humanity, and hopefully you are empathetic enough. I think most writers are full of empathy. I think that's how we connect to people.
Right.
Then I think you can do the research, and like you said, if the quality of the writing is up to it, you can write anything. And I think it also, if you had to write what there'd be so many genres we could no longer have. Well, aliens and fantasy and everything else. It would be very sad.
Write what interests you, right?
Yeah.
And then research it.
And always write the book you want to read. That's my number one mantra. If I don't want to read it, nobody else will.
Right.
Yes, I think you're right.
There are a couple of really good questions, if you don't mind me interweaving these in. Annika, she says, let's see, I just lost it. You both make such multi-dimensional characters, including the villains. Do you ever feel for the perpetrators when they're caught and have to go to jail?
I do. I feel a lot of sympathy for my villains, even the really nasty ones. And I think part of it that is because you literally created these people. So even though they're terrible, you should know why they became the way they became, and why they act the way they act. And yeah, I do feel sympathy and empathy for my villains more than I should probably.
I tend to avoid writing villain point of view, and partly I think for that reason, that it's a hard space for me to be in, because yes, they are the hero in their own story, and I use villain point of view when it's necessary, but I avoid it when I can, because I don't want to like them.
Yeah, it's like they don't consider themselves villains, right?
No, not at all.
In their own world. Well, maybe some of them do. Let's see here. Okay, here's a great one. Sue just wrote, do you start with the suspense or the romance first when planning out a book?
For me, the first kernel is either the setting or the heroine's profession. And so because the heroine's profession, if it's going to relate to the history and archaeology of the area, that's going to help me come up with the twists and turns of the suspense plot and everything. And so I guess then it's looking for what is going to be the proper foil as far as the romance goes. That's me, I think. And it depends.
Yeah, it's kind of the same for me. It's slightly different. Generally more on average, more from the hero's point of view. But especially because I've already set up these characters in advance. So now I want a plot that is credible. I want a credible plot, and I want there has to be a reason for them to be involved. And I want them, and also just to make life difficult for myself, I want them to be involved officially. So a lot of the time you see, I might shoot myself in the foot because I might end up doing this anyway, but a lot of time you see some law enforcement person or a person out of the military, and they're taken away from their active duty roles, and they're back home when something happens. And I kind of want them to be within their FBI role as well. So come up with the plot, and which normally comes from 3 or 4 different ideas that have been spinning around in my head. And normally if I can get them three ideas to mesh, then I normally know I've got a story that will work. And then the heroine tends to come from a combination of the, what do I need to make this plot work? So she has to be the missing link out of the. It can be a hero, but normally it's the heroine, because at the moment, especially, most of my main protagonists have been male. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
One difference between Toni's books and mine is that most of hers are, one of the central protagonists is law enforcement of some form or another, whereas on mine it's almost none of my books. they can be military, but they're not law enforcement. It just, it's one of those sort of basic differences that, we write different kinds of stories in that, but we have such a huge overlap in readership because we're like each fulfilling the niche that readers like in both areas, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think your way is actually much harder. I think it's harder to write about solving mysteries or crime when you're not actually don't have
when the crime is handed
protagonists
to you as an investigation. I have to put them in the situation, and then the crime happens, versus the crime, the opening of your book is well, there's the prologue, which is a crime happening, and then the opening is the murder, the murder scene of the serial killer. So and they're already investigating, and I'm, the opening of my book, we don't know what parts of the crime have already happened. She's showing up before the bad stuff really starts to happen, and then they have to slowly figure it out. So that generally is true for my books. I think, that the crime happens in real time, and is not something that you're coming at after the investigation has started.
It's funny, I picture almost the shape of a braid kind of going forward, intertwining plot, character, different strands, kind of all, and they're all equally important,
Mm-hmm.
and keeping
I think of it like weaving, but yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just lost all my notes, excuse me.
I just wanted to ask, Hazel, who's watching on YouTube, has a number of questions. I'm sorry, Hazel, I missed them until just right now, but let me just go through them real quick. Hi, Toni and Rachel, you're two of my absolute favorites. You both have mastered the skill of balancing the romance and the suspense, never been disappointed. We're getting to a question here. I love the technical and professional competence of the heroine characters in both your books. It's a great comment. But here's the question. Given how quickly technology and science develop these days, do you shy away from putting, firm details in your stories, or do you use them to ensure that the book tech is explicable when the book is 10 years old?
That's a good question. I don't shy away from it, but I do recognize that it could date, and I definitely updated some of my original, the book on the horse ranch in Montana had to be updated because when I wrote that, there were still beepers as opposed to cell phones. So yes,
I may have misread this question. I'm sorry. Or do you shy away from putting firm dates?
Oh,
question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, Hazel, I missed that detail. Firms in your stories.
If you read very closely, you could figure out the timeline of my stories, because I have given years in a few places, but I try not to. I try not to. One time I actually did it in the author's note, just simply to explain why, because I was writing a book in my Flashpoint series, and I decided that I had this character in my Evidence series who could play this really fabulous role if he shows up on scene, but he has to show up on scene in a place in his life timeline that was before the book that was already published with him as the hero. He had to still be a Russian spy and no longer a Russian spy. And I did the math on the two series, and I realized I could do it. I could slip him in because this one series was taking place in this time frame, but there was nowhere in the book did I give the year. And so in the author's note, I was like, all right, for readers who are wondering why he's still a Russian spy, it's because this book took place before that one. And that's the only place you'll see the year related to that series.
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult things actually is when you have characters who have become the way they are because of some event in history. So you're kind of stuck when you put that in your timeline. I'm thinking mainly like 9/11. A lot of people joined the military after that and signed up, and you know, you have all of a sudden that's now, you know, a lot of years later. So that could date your stories if people are paying too much attention to the timeline. But I try very hard to fudge dates as much as possible. I know the
as much
dates.
as possible.
I've got them all written down, and I know everything from when my babies are born and to which readers actually do ask me about. and they want to know. So so I use a program to keep a track of, I think, 26 books now, and they're all in this, and the major dates and timelines are all there. So I do know.
I have a chart. I don't have anything super elaborate, but I do have a chart because I have multiple series now that are feeding into that. But I do on the flip side of that, I have a proofreader who she knows the timeline. She has the years. And if I say that, you know, it's basically it happened multiple times, but one book in particular, I mentioned the phase of the moon and the week that it was in October. And she did the math and she checked to make sure that my moon phase was right. She was like, oh, this must be, you know, this date in October and this is the year, and okay, your moon phase is right. So I just want you to know that my books are so thoroughly proofread that if I give the phase of the moon, you can bank on it.
That's awesome. That is so cool.
Because I do look up the phase of the moon when
I do too.
Annika asks, is there something new that you've learned in your research lately that has surprised you? That might require a bit of thought, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. While you're thinking about that, I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I do. I have an answer.
Yeah.
So I was for this book I've just written, I was researching high altitude, high opening jumps. And I hadn't realized that they switched to full oxygen, breathing full oxygen on the way to, you know, their destination, climbing to their height, because to eliminate nitrogen from their bloodstream. So I used to be a diver, so, you know, it makes perfect sense when I think about it from that perspective, but it's not something I had not recognized until that point. So.
That was way smarter than any answer I'm able to come up with right now. So.
Has either of you dealt with, because you're dealing with, you know, these, has either of you dealt with PTSD in any way in your books?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't go deep into it, but the hero in this book definitely has some unaddressed PTSD that is something that, you know, that is going to be ongoing. I mean, he knows it. He was injured, and he's no longer a SEAL. He's now training SEALs. He's now the guy who's putting and organizing the training together because he can't do ops after an injury. And so it's there, and you know the only way he's dealing with it so far is throwing himself into his work, you know, but you know, and I have another character who very much had all sorts of PTSD that was being addressed on the page, but I haven't delved super deep into showing the other side of it, the working through it. I've just kind of touched on it. I've just basically, like, you know, it's there. So Toni?
Yeah, I've had characters suffering from PTSD in a couple of different books. I mean, even though in Cold Silence, it is part of the plot as well, because they lose one of their teammates. But I don't really go into depth. But there's the book I mentioned that's set in Northern Labrador. That hero is completely, like, I talk about character arc. He is a mess at the start, complete and it's because of PTSD, and he knows it. He's a helicopter pilot now, and he's former British Special Forces, but he recognizes it in himself. But he's not getting any treatment at that point. By the end of the book, he does get treatment, and has to get treatment before he can get his happy ever after, which is good. And I also have a heroine who goes through some terrible things in one of my negotiator books, and she was never supposed to be a heroine, but it's just one of those characters that kind of takes hold and doesn't let go. So then she got her own book, but I certainly have to deal with, and of course as a writer, you kind of have to deal with it on an accelerated time frame, especially if your book plot has a very specific time frame. Your recovery might have to be maybe faster than would happen in real life, and there's no way of getting around that, really. I don't know how you can change that. So yeah. I was looked into the most recent treatments, and some of the most recent treatments are actually very encouraging. And so she was being treated with this, and so I was hoping. But I think for PTSD, obviously I'm not an expert, but I'm sure it's an ongoing condition that requires a lot of years of work.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, here's a good question that we've actually kind of skirted around during this discussion, which is, can you talk about the skill of telling readers about your book without giving away spoilers? And is this something you think about, when you're writing the novel?
The pithy one-liners is probably the easiest way to do that. So for example, I have a book that I'm contracted to write for Thomson Mercer. And there's very little I can tell you about it, because almost the whole book is going to be a major spoiler. But I can tell you that it is about a crime reporter who finds herself in a position. She was abducted and brutalized for 48 hours, but she never reported it for very real reasons. She was never able to report it, and now 2 years later, she gets a tip from an informant that gives her a lead that she now has to investigate her own personal crime story. And that's basically all I can tell you. And it's both the premise and the description.
Yeah, I find it very difficult. I have to stop myself a lot of the time, because I'm one of these people that just blurts stuff out, and then think, oh, I shouldn't have said that. So I do find it very difficult, and I think it's very hard to actually. I don't feel like I've actually talked about my book very much, because it's very difficult to talk about a plot that hinges on a few key events which are kind of traumatic at the beginning, and the shock value is actually part of the reader enjoyment, really. So yes, you can't have too many. Yeah, I find it very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, as on the other side, when conducting all these programs and interviews, that becomes our challenge as well. It's like Barbara and I are very we're very conscious of that, and it's a fine line, because there's certain books that you really can't say much, and others you can kind of get in and talk about them without giving away the plot and everything. But it is a challenge always.
Definitely.
But let's see here, before we wrap it up, and this has been a really fun program, we always have people watching that are aspiring writers. Can you both maybe talk a little bit about your, how do the kids say, the path to publication? And also, do you have any advice for aspiring writers who are just kind of getting in and doubting their own, self-confidence and things like that? Toni, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, my road to publication is incredibly long and arduous. But at the same time not. So I did my PhD, and then I did 2 postdocs, and I was doing a second postdoc in Ontario when I basically read the entire library at Waterloo Public Library. I ran out of books. So in my spare time, I decided that I would start writing some of these books that I really enjoyed. And I think most writers learn, or you learn by reading, number one. So read, any advice to aspiring authors would be read what you love and read what you want to write. And then I started to write, and it took many years. So I was pregnant with my first child when I decided that I was going to totally go for this full time, and declared to my husband, sorry about the PhD, but I'm going to write romance novels. Which I'm sure he thought I was completely crazy, but we were also moving around a lot, so it kind of worked, little kids and moving from one country to the next. So it wasn't a terrible idea. And then I got my first publishing contract with I think called Triskelion Publishing, way back in early 2000s, and they went out of business after a few years. And then I was, writing all the time, and submitting back in the day, submitting to agents, submitting to publishing houses. And then I wrote a book that called The Killing Game, which nobody could figure out what to do with it, but it did get me an agent who, first of all, it got me an offer from one publishing house, and then which got me an agent, which got me a publishing contract with Montlake Romance for two books. And that's kind of when I kind of took off, I suppose, when I considered myself a published author. And I did have 3 books with Harlequin Carina Press before that as well. But each step in your career which step feels like the significant one. I think the Montlake Publishing one felt like the significant change. And then self-publishing kind of arrived. And even though I wasn't first on the bandwagon, once I discovered that I could do it and that I could be successful at it, the level of control I have over my own books and publishing schedule and just everything associated is so huge and complete that I can't imagine going back, actually. So that's my road to publishing or being published. But beginning authors, I think, don't give up, keep doing it, keep writing, and you keep reading. I think the fact that self-publishing is so accessible can be a bit of a curse as well. So I'm all for authors getting their work out there, but make sure you learn the craft as well. Don't skip the craft side of it.
My journey was similar in length to Toni's. I started writing when my daughter was 2, and before I was pregnant with my son. So that was in 2002. I got an agent in 2011. And then when started self-publishing in 2013. And actually it wasn't until 2020 that my agent sold a frontlist deal. I'd had her for 9 years, where she was selling sub-rights and backlist and everything. But I self-published first, and it was actually my 18th book published was my first one that had a publisher. So, but I learned a lot in those years of honing my craft. I mean, I consider myself lucky that self-publishing wasn't available in those early years, because the fact that it took so long to find to get an agent meant that I was spending those years really honing my craft. And actually every book I've ever written is published. So that first book needed a lot of work, but yeah, I learned so much in going through that process of rejection. I found some great critique partners. I learned how to take feedback, and how to figure out what resonated with me, like what feedback was good and relevant and what feedback I could ignore. And, now I'm, writing relatively clean, just because it became this natural organic process. Toni writes really cool too.
I don't. I really don't. I write
By the time I get
drafts.
it,
Well, many drafts.
One of the things we hear a lot is I've heard a lot of authors giving advice. They say, don't chase trends, you know, because what might be really popular in 2022 is not going to be so hot next year, you know?
Yeah.
So
I think that feeds into what Rachel says, just write what you love, because if you don't love it, then, and you create a mega best-selling author of whatever it happens to be, you know, it's hard to move away from the thing that makes you popular. So I think writing what you love to start with, really, for us, it worked for us anyway.
Yeah.
That's any advice. It always, it might not work for you.
Right. Well, Rachel and Toni, it's been a delightful hour. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And here
Thank you.
are your two new books right here. Cold Silence,
Thank you so much.
Into the Storm. Oh, by the way, before we end, can you talk a little bit about, I've noticed this particularly with romantic suspense novels. Can you talk about the importance of having a kind of a series tag? I don't see that a lot in in other genres as much. I do see it occasionally, but does it kind of point to the ensemble cast as opposed to a Temperance Brennan thriller or a Harry Bosch novel?
What you're saying, yeah. Well, we don't have the same protagonist for every book. So we're showing that they're connected in this world. So it's basically more of a world connection when it's a new couple each book, or yeah. I have one series that's the Fiona Carver series, which is on the shelf behind you there. Dangerous Ground is the first book in that series, and it is the same couple for the two books that are published. And so that's why it's her name and not the world name.
I see.
But both Toni and I did this our new series or spin-offs of our existing series, because again, they have a different framework. There are new types of books, but you also want to have a connection to get readers to go back to those other earlier books, but you want a new entry point. You need a new book one, because people, my evidence series is 12 books long. Toni, how long is your original Cold Justice series?
Well, 10 and then 5.
Yeah.
So it gets long.
People see that, there's 10 books. I don't even, want to start at the beginning, but I'll try this one. That's the first book. And then you've hooked them, and then they go back and they read all the rest.
Yeah.
So that's what the series name is for.
I see. Yeah. A shrewd marketing decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, again, it's been great talking with you both. And thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in today on our online audience. And congratulations on both of your new books. And
Thank you.
I just want to wish you the most success.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You bet. Good night.